This video is sponsored by War Thunder. Play War Thunder for free and get a premium aircraft, tank or ship and a 3-day account upgrade as a bonus. Available on PC, PS4 and Xbox One. More on them in a bit. American politics is rarely a setting for controversial heroes. Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, Roosevelt. Public opinion has settled and congealed around these men, offering rosy soliloquies of their patriotic fortitude that echo throughout the generations. The American institution rarely examines the complex reality of its historical figures. That's simply not possible with today's protagonist, a modern-day Machiavelli whose quick rise and fall to power forces us to weigh his intents against his methods. He was a smooth-talking Louisianan who considered himself a righteous everyman, both before and after he took complete control over his state's political machine. He threatened assassinations, installed puppet governors, and ruthlessly taxed enemy factions, but it was all for the greater good of his people. Is there room in a republic for autocratic benevolence? Well, you be the judge while we examine the life and times of Huey Long. Huey Pierce Long was born on August 30th, 1893 in Winnfield, Louisiana. Long's family was quite large. His mother, Caledonia Tison, and father, Huey Sr., conceived 9 living children. Huey was the 7th. At the turn of the century, much of Louisiana was poor and uneducated, but even by local standards, Winnfield was a tough place to make a living. The Long family was far from rich, but they were well off relative to their surrounding community. Huey Sr. and Caledonia made a living as livestock farmers and lived in a small southern manor house. The Longs rarely had much trouble making ends meet, but plenty of people around them did, which was a major influence on young Huey. One story recounts how, as an 8-year-old boy, he watched his neighbor lose his house and farm at auction when the neighbor failed to pay his debts on time. The farmer begged to be given his home back, swearing that he'd pay his debts if he just had a few more days to get the money together. Just as the sheriff was about to stop the auction and grant the neighbor's request, a creditor made a bid, winning the farm. As an adult, Huey Long recalled the events, remarking that he was horrified. "I could not understand," he said. "It seemed criminal." Winnfield helped mold Huey Long in more ways than one. It wasn't just the abject poverty around him, it was also the unfiltered contempt that many of the northern Louisianans felt for their richer southern neighbors. As I said, Louisiana has never really been a wealthy state, but much of the money that it does have is concentrated in larger population hubs like Baton Rouge and New Orleans. Many people from quaint, poor North Louisiana towns like Winnfield often resented the hoity-toity upper class that primarily resided closer to the coast. Take the Civil War as an example. Like most of its southern neighbors, Louisiana seceded from the Union and fought as part of the Confederacy in the American Civil War. When state representatives gathered for a vote on secession, delegates from Winnfield voted to remain in the Union, not because of any forward-thinking positions on slavery or states' rights, but, as the Winnfield delegate put it, who wants to fight to keep the Negroes for the wealthy planters? It wasn't a civil rights argument at all, it was class warfare. In the late 19th century, Winnfield and the surrounding area became a local hub of populist politics. In 1912, the local parish actually supported the Socialist Party presidential candidate Eugene Debs over all other candidates. It was not a place that trusted corporate priorities or power structures. Those who did have jobs worked in blue-collar industries at local lumber mills and salt mines. Huey Long's worldview was highly influenced by his childhood in Winnfield. He was a curious child, exploring the farm and the world around him, asking questions and listening to political philosophy from a young age. Public schooling was sporadic in rural parts of Louisiana at the turn of the century, so Huey was homeschooled until adolescence, as was common for many boys at the time. When he finally did reach public school, he was initially praised as gifted with an uncommonly good memory. He routinely asked teachers to allow him to skip coursework or even entire grades when he was already familiar with the material. At Winnfield High, Huey began to really use his intelligence on the debate team. At one point, he traveled to Baton Rouge and finished third in a statewide debate contest, earning himself an academic scholarship to attend LSU after high school. Unfortunately, he would never be able to cash in on the winnings. He couldn't afford the textbooks or the room and board. Huey would return to Winnfield with his only remaining prize being all that increased female attention that skilled high school debate club winners are accustomed to. Huey soldiered on throughout his remaining coursework, graduating from Winnfield High School in 1910 after completing the 11th grade, or at least that's what he thought. Just as Huey Long finished the 11th grade and was set to receive his diploma, the State Board of Education passed a new law saying that the 12th grade would be the new ending point for high school students. Huey, the skilled debater as he was, thought that the new law was a crock of crayfish, and he began circulating a formal petition denouncing the idea of 12th grade and formally criticizing the principal and teachers at Winnfield High. Ultimately, Huey got his wish. He never had to complete the 12th grade because the school expelled him. As a result, he never graduated from high school. With Huey Long's high school education officially over, he knew he needed to find a job. Like a lot of biographics' protagonists, Mr. Long was a multi-talented man who could adequately perform quite a few tasks. He would sign up for just about any job that didn't involve farm work. He wasn't keen on chores around the house as a child, and he wasn't about to sign up for any more of it as an adult. Long wanted to be out in the world, around people and things. He never wanted to end up back at home, surrounded by chickens and goats. So at the age of 17, Long became a traveling salesman, touring much of the American South and selling everything from cooking sherry to home medicines. It was a job he had quite a bit of natural talent for, and as such, he found success right out of school for a solid year. But as the economy stalled and sales became harder, Long was forced out of his budding young sales career and forced to consider a new line of work. His mother, who had always hoped her seventh son would use his God-given intellect and communication skills in a more righteous calling, pushed him to move to Oklahoma so that he might move in with his older brother George and study the Bible. In the fall of 1911, he began attending seminary lectures at Oklahoma Baptist College in Shawnee. Well, attending lectures is a rather loose way of putting it. Long quickly deduced that he was no man of the cloth and began skipping classes. He washed out of seminary school after one semester, much to the chagrin of his devout Baptist mother. But before he left Oklahoma, he thought he might want to give law school a try. George lent him $100 and pointed him towards the University of Oklahoma's School of Law, where he similarly lasted one semester. He received average grades and didn't learn very much thanks to a slew of distractions ranging from girls to gambling. He enjoyed the local political scene in Norman, where the University of Oklahoma is, but he never focused enough on law while he was in town to really get serious about a career in litigation. He lost his $100 and a gambling ring leaving town to return to a promising sales position that had opened up for him. Long was still a teenager when he left Oklahoma, but he had a real mind for sales. He learned early on that dressing well lent a salesman credibility, and that playing music could help him draw a crowd and foster a commercially appealing atmosphere. He tapped into his natural powers of empathy to connect with potential clients. As a traveling salesman who encountered working-class people all over the American South, he quickly developed a sense of fellowship with everyday Americans. There was another relationship that Huey Long was quickly developing too, a blooming romance with a woman named Rose McConnell. Long and McConnell met in 1910, early in his sales career, at a bake sale that had been organized in Shreveport to promote the sale of a lard substitute called Olin. Huey had a little bit of game, so he awarded the top two prizes to Rose and her mother. They married 2.5 years later on April 12, 1913, at the Gayoso Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. They went on to have 3 children named Rose, Russell, and Palmer. Sales remains a good career choice for Long, but it also continued to prove inconsistent and fickle. In 1914, the economy again threw Huey and Rose out of the industry and back toward formal schooling, but this time he had a much clearer plan. His eldest brother, Julius, who was already a working attorney, helped him create a streamlined law school outline specifically targeting course material that he would need to know in order to pass the bar. Huey and Rose moved to New Orleans, and just 3 semesters later in 1915, Huey had cobbled together enough knowledge and information that he was able to pass the bar exam. He was 21 at the time. Long returned to Winnfield, where he now had the legal tools he needed to grind his axe against the corporate interests that he had grown to loathe over the course of his young life. He began building his reputation as a lawyer by representing poor, powerless, or disenfranchised Louisianans. He opened a law office in the space above the Winnfield Bank, which was run by his uncle George. He promptly sent waves through both the community and his own family by representing a widow in court against the very bank he shared a building with. His uncle was incredulous that young Huey had taken the case, as it appeared to represent a conflict of interest. Huey remarked that his uncle should feel complimented. Huey Long don't take out after top waters, but after the big fish. Cajun metaphors and third-person speech aside, Long was a gifted lawyer. He quickly gained notoriety in northern Louisiana as an attorney who wasn't afraid of targeting powerful groups, making him popular among many of the local populists. In 1918, after 3 years in Winnfield, he and Rose moved to Shreveport, where they had more clients and more resources at their disposal. He also began one of his life's biggest conflicts, his ongoing standoff with John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. Around the time that Long moved to Shreveport, he also invested about $1,000 into a local well that eventually struck oil. Long was set to make a major profit off the investment, but Rockefeller Standard Oil wasn't interested in buying the oil from this particular well, making it theoretically valuable but practically useless. Long had made a sizable investment and gambled correctly, yet he still lost his money because of the whims of Standard Oil. His righteous anger, alongside his established animosity towards power and corporations, touched off an ongoing feud that he would continue to stoke for the remainder of his life. He called Standard Oil an invisible empire that was run by petrolumites. He made his first formal shot across the bow in 1921 when he began representing a small oil company who had a disputed lease with Standard Oil. Long lost this court case, which only fueled his hatred more. But there was one interest for Huey Long that captured his attention much more than legal battles and oil wells. What began as a natural curiosity for politics had grown into a full-fledged career interest, and Long was no longer contented to attack the power structure as a private citizen. He wanted to do it as an elected official. Now, just before we continue with the video today, I do want to take a quick moment to thank our sponsor, War Thunder. War Thunder is a realistic, free-to-play military vehicle combat game. It's available on PC, PS4, and Xbox One, but you only need one of those. No need to purchase it either. You just download the game and you get to playing. In this game, there are over 1,500 historically accurate vehicles all the way from the 1920s to the 1990s. They're all carefully built, incredibly detailed, and all the physics, you can tell that it's really been sweated over. Plus, the sound is really immersive. And look, you can just jump in for a quick game. It's an arcade game. It's useful if you don't have a lot of time, or you can play realistic and go for some more challenging stuff. Or if you're hardcore, you can go for simulator. But yeah, I mean, if you're new, you're probably just going to get your ass whipped over and over again. So maybe start on arcade and go from there. So join us on the battlefield for free using the link below. Doing that supports this show, and you also get a free premium tank, ship, or aircraft, and 3 days of premium time as a bonus just for registering. And let's get back to the video. Huey Long officially became a politician when he earned election to the State Railroad Commission in 1918 at the age of 25. He used his position on the three-man board to limit corporate monopolies and reduce utility rates for average households. He believed he was the sort of populist everyman that 20th century American politics should rely upon. Just as Long had quickly gained local acclaim as a populist-minded attorney, he similarly gained statewide notoriety for the hell he raised from his elected position. The State Railroad Commission was eventually rechristened as the broader Public Service Commission, and Long became its chairman in 1922. His first act was to sue the Cumberland Telephone Company for raising their rates by 20% for no particular reason. His first attempt lost, but he argued his appeal before the US Supreme Court and won. Cumberland was forced to cut refund checks totaling $440,000. This was distributed to 80,000 customers who had been overcharged. Subsequently, Chief Justice William Howard Taft described Long as the most brilliant lawyer who ever practiced before the United States Supreme Court. The Cumberland case won Long thousands of statewide fans, so Long decided to run for governor in 1924. As he had done his entire life, he mocked the ruling political establishment in New Orleans, labeling them as toothless pawns of malevolent companies like Standard Oil. Ultimately, he finished third in the race, missing the runoff by about 7,000 votes. Long blames the poor weather, which wasn't an entirely unfair observation on his part. With only 200 and some miles of paved roads in all of Louisiana at the time, heavy downpours transformed dirt roads into intractable muddy messes. Given that the core of Long's base was the rural populist contingent, the weather almost certainly impacted his showing to some degree. But the weather wouldn't be a problem 4 years later, when Long successfully took the mantle from acting governor Oramel Simpson. By 1928, Long had carefully constructed a massive populist alliance in Louisiana. He spent 4 years traipsing across the isolated northern parishes, building his coalition by a dozen blue-collar workers at a time. He also improved his reputation in the more gilded southern parts of the state by supporting Roman Catholic candidates in an area dominated by traditional Spanish and French heritage. He tied everything together with a slogan he adopted from 19th century populist William Jennings Bryan. Every man a king, but no one wears a crown. Long won the Democratic primary election on January the 17th, 1928. Despite the fact that it was a heated three-way election, Long won by what was at the time the largest margin in state history. Predictably, he went on to cruise in the general election, winning more than 95% of the vote over Republican candidate Etienne Caire. At 34 years old, Huey Long became the youngest governor in the history of Louisiana, a record that still holds to this day. Long's ascendance to the governorship was a radical departure for state politics. Since Louisiana had become a state 116 years prior, it had more or less been governed by the same corrupt members of the Good Old Boys network in Louisiana, all of whom had clear ties to the church, the upper class, or powerful corporate interests. Long's election undid all of that, giving the average Louisianan a much more accessible ally in the governor's mansion. And most Louisiana residents needed that ally. In the late 1920s, Louisiana was arguably the poorest state in the US, with grossly underfunded public works and public education systems. Those who could afford to navigate their children to and from school every day still had to purchase their own textbooks, among other supplies, making regular old primary schools a huge burden for most families. 25% of adults could not read, massive bridge tolls limited people's ability to move around in their own communities, and poll taxes had disenfranchised poor people of all racial backgrounds. And keep in mind, these were the good times. This was in 1928, just months before the start of the Great Depression. Everything was about to get a whole lot worse. Long had solutions to many of these problems, but his methodology is what catapulted him to national fame. Almost immediately, he fired hundreds of old guard bureaucrats, replacing them with friends and young populists who he believed would serve his vision of what Louisiana politics could be. After consolidating his executive power and installing yes-men everywhere he could, he began an ambitious 1929 legislative session designed at pushing through a number of bills that he had promised in his campaign, focusing on economic stimulus and improved state infrastructure. He lowered one bridge toll from $8.40 to 60 cents. He instituted night courses for adult literacy that taught more than 100,000 people to read by the end of his term. He levied a new tax on Standard Oil that paid for all textbooks for grade school children. Long was undoubtedly enacting large-scale wealth distribution, a political prospect that rarely succeeds on American soil. But Louisiana was so fundamentally broken by 100 years of corruption that most everyday people didn't seem to mind. That's not to say that everyone was on board, however. Long's strongman methods were well-meaning, but they were also democratically dangerous, and it didn't take long for an organized political movement to rise up against him. In 1929, while Long was trying to levy a new occupational license tax against his friends at the Standard Oil Company, his project was met with cries of foul play. Opponents in the legislature called for an impeachment on the grounds of abuse of power, among several other charges, and the impeachment was sustained with a 67-13 vote. When some in the pro-Long camp discerned the electric voting machine used for the impeachment vote may have been tampered with, an all-out brawl broke out on the floor of the State House, which was locally christened as Bloody Monday and reached its crescendo when Huey's brother Earl bit a legislator on the neck. No word on whether or not Earl Long was secretly a vampire. I assume this will be covered in a future season of True Detective. Regarding the ongoing political charges, Huey continued to speak directly to the people of Louisiana, where he knew that he could best plead his case. This money he was trying to earmark was for them, the people, and it was a good cause, social programs that would help lift Louisiana out of the icy grips of poverty. Ultimately, the State House passed 7 articles of impeachment to the Senate, which immediately declared its intent to acquit Long of the charges, regardless of whether or not he was guilty. In their eyes, the impeachment should have never gone forward in the first place, and they were treating it with the lack of seriousness that they thought it deserved. In all likelihood, Long's 1929 impeachment was organized in backrooms by oil tycoons and wealthy titans of industry who wanted to rid themselves of the Long nightmare before any more damage could be done. There were no lessons here for Huey Long about politics or democracy, only power. He doubled down on his authoritarian strategies, committing to violence, intimidation, and ruthless political operation to accomplish his populist goals. "I used to try to get things done by saying please," Huey Long told the press. "Now I dynamite him out of my path." Over the remainder of his term, Huey Long effectively transformed his status as governor into that of a local dictator. The ends will justify the means, he told people. He continued replacing appointed officials all around city and state governments with populists that he felt were loyal supporters whom he could trust. He also began a political tithe that he called his war chest. Anyone who received a job from Huey was forced to give up a portion of their salary for a private fund that Long kept locked away for either campaign needs or personal projects. Long also surrounded himself with armed bodyguards at all times, in part for show and in part because he had begun to receive death threats. It's an understandable reaction, but when you look like a strong man and walk around like a strong man, you start to act a little bit like one too. At one point, a drunken Long allegedly told one of his bodyguards to kill State Representative J. Weiss Sanders Jr., leave him in a ditch where nobody will know where or how he got there. Long still had lofty populist goals, but had also become an obvious autocrat who was hell-bent on amassing as much political power as possible. In 1930, with half his gubernatorial term still remaining, he decided to run for US Senate, selling his campaign as a referendum on his political ideology. If you liked what he was doing for Louisiana, he asked that you also vote for him for Congress. If not, he would resign the governorship. Long was running against 72-year-old incumbent Senator Joseph Randsell of the Constitutional League. Long routinely mocked his opponent, declaring him a member of the Constipational League. Huey Long eventually won in a landslide in September of 1930, earning 57% of the vote. But Long stayed in Louisiana, fearful to cede the power he had amassed to his lieutenant governor by assuming his new congressional position in Washington. He presided over hellish state legislature sessions by screaming at those who disagreed with him, ordering them to sit down and shut up. One night, Long steamrolled 40 bills through the state house in under 2 hours. He had so thoroughly stacked the state bureaucracy in his favor that no one could effectively speak against him. It was in these final dictatorial days as governor where Long finally earned his infamous nickname. A political supporter dubbed him the Kingfish, after a smooth-talking character from a popular fictional radio program called Amos and Andy. The name immediately stuck, beloved by friends and foes alike, including Long himself. Long fended off a slow-moving coup in 1931 when his own lieutenant governor, Paul Sere, announced that he did not believe Long could be senator and governor at the same time. Sere declared himself to be the rightful governor of Louisiana, which, regardless of whether he was right or wrong about the legality of Long's dual statuses, was a pretty stupid plan. Long had the National Guard surround the state capitol and then had Sere removed from the office by arguing to the state Supreme Court that Sere had resigned his duly elected position when he attempted to assume the governorship. With Sere gone, Long installed a puppet, Alvin King, who temporarily assumed the governorship as Long left for Washington in 1932. Huey's long-term puppet, Oscar Allen, won the full job in the gubernatorial election of 1932 as Long settled into his senatorial duties, still completely in command of Louisiana state politics. As Long pivoted to national politics, he supported fellow progressive Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the election of 1932, believing he was the only candidate with policies that could shepherd the US through the Depression. But after FDR won office, Long actually became a major critic of the New Deal, attacking Roosevelt's flagship legislative package from the left. He believed that FDR and his Depression-era policies were not doing enough to redistribute wealth in America. Roosevelt, in turn, labeled Huey Long as a radical demagogue. Long spent his time in the Senate advocating for free college tuition and seeding the ground for similar grassroots movements across America that helped him rise to power in his own state. In February 1934, he launched a radical initiative called the Share Our Wealth campaign that might still be the most radical left-of-center idea ever seriously floated by a major American politician. Long wanted to cap personal annual incomes at $1 million and cap personal fortunes at $50 million. The resulting tax income would help build a guaranteed household income for every American family. Long took care to remind Americans that 65% of the country's wealth was controlled by 2% of the population. His plan would aggressively attempt to smooth those numbers out, offering every family a month's paid vacation, old age pension, and guaranteed 30-hour-long work week, among other benefits. It was, to be sure, a radical plan, even by New Deal standards. When the US Senate refused to seriously consider his proposal, he started a private society, the Share Our Wealth Society, which attracted more than 7 million members by 1935. Unfortunately, Huey Long would not live long enough to reap the political benefits of his ideas. He published his first book, Every Man a King, in 1933, and had begun writing a second tome called My First Days in the White House that made it pretty clear where his personal ambitions lay. But on September the 8th, 1935, Long made his way to the Capitol building to vote on House Bill No. 1, a rezoning plan whose meta goal was to oust a judge named Benjamin Henry Pavy that Long considered a political opponent. Long and his allies passed the bill late that night after 9 p.m. Shortly afterward, Pavy's son-in-law, Carl Weiss, approached Long and shot him one time in the chest. Weiss died almost instantly after Long's bodyguards shot him more than 60 times. Long himself died at the hospital more than 24 hours later after doctors were unable to successfully repair the internal damage to his body. There are conflicting reports over what his last words were, but one theory reports that they may have been, "God, don't let me die, I have so much to do." He was 42. Long remains a controversial figure in American history because of the lengths he went to consolidate power and advance the populist legislation. There is little doubt that he is a beloved figure in Louisiana. More than 200,000 people attended his funeral, and his body was buried on the grounds of a new state capitol building, which he directly helped fund with one of his tax initiatives. But outside of Louisiana, on a national level, Long is often remembered for his authoritarian strategies and his radical economic initiatives rather than his statewide benevolence. He took money by force and used it to improve the lives of blue-collar Americans, and he scoffed at the checks and balances that are designed to constrain political power. Huey Long remains one of the ultimate American Rorschach tests for Machiavellian principles. As Long once noted, the ends can justify the means, but that's an awfully dangerous mindset when your sworn enemies have pistols. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe. Brand new videos just like this a couple of times a week. Also, please do check out our fantastic sponsor, War Thunder, link below. And thank you for watching.